Hi guys, Max here, and today we're going to talk about the situation in Ukraine, what exactly is going on right now, and why a lot of people just don't really understand the true objectives of both the West, NATO, and the US, but also Russia, and why those people keep getting things wrong over and over again. Now, this is the second video for the day, again on top of the daily market update earlier. I will of course be reading the comments as usual, so make sure to let me know if this format works for you, if you prefer it or if you hate it, and also apologies in advance if you hear some background noise. There's a storm where I am right now, and this behind me is a 200-year-old chimney, so it can get a little bit loud. Now, very quickly, what's the background of the situation in Ukraine for anyone who maybe lives under a rock? Well, after the end of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, Eastern Europe in general, whatever you want to call it, it westernized, and lots of countries have now joined NATO. Now, some of these countries have seen huge success. The Baltic countries especially are a brilliant example of countries that were held back under the USSR by communism, but have now been able to thrive under capitalism. Now, Ukraine is a big country. It's very close to Russia, and Russia saw it and always has seen it as a buffer state to keep NATO away from its borders, but Russia has been less than tame, very aggressive towards Ukraine, and this has pushed Ukraine closer to the West for some time now, and they are now very vocal about wanting to join NATO. Now, Russia absolutely hate this idea. They want to keep NATO away from their borders, and there's also a large Russian ethnic population in Ukraine, especially in specific parts of Ukraine like Crimea, and Russia would of course be happy to increase their influence and their power by annexing Ukraine, by becoming more powerful, more populated, and wealthy and everything like that. Now, in the earlier 2010s, there was a lot of talk of Russia taking control of Crimea, and there was quite a lot of support for this as well in Crimea itself, and there actually ended up being a referendum about Crimea becoming Russian. It had a decent chance of passing legitimately, but it was corrupted by fraud. The results were basically statistically impossible. Now, following the referendum, Russia literally invaded Crimea. They took control, and they now consider it to be part of Russia. Today, Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine, claiming that they need to ensure that Ukraine doesn't join the West, as that would supposedly damage Russia's security. Now, Russia's demands, very simply, are that Ukraine never be allowed into NATO, that it remains in Russia's sphere of influence as well. And Western demands are basically that Russia not invade and that Ukraine can do as it pleases as a sovereign nation. Now, Russia has been building up troops on the border of Ukraine, threatening to invade. The West has been sending over weapons and sending troops over to Eastern Europe as well, claiming that if Russia does invade, there will be loads of consequences and sanctions. That, at a very basic level, is where we are today, and I really did try, for that part at least, to be unbiased there. The only thing that I think people might disagree with me on is the referendum being fraudulent, but from what I've read and seen, the result that Russia claims happened is basically statistically impossible without fraud when you look at all of the polling done by neutral participants and biased ones as well. Now, the very recent developments of the situation are basically that it isn't getting any better. No, Russia hasn't invaded Ukraine, but it is escalating slowly but surely. Russia now, as of today, has about 190,000 troops on the border of Ukraine from north, east, and south, and this is up from about 100,000 a few weeks ago. Russian separatists have started evacuating civilians and sending them to Russia in what might be a precursor to increased intensity in the fighting over there in the east of the country. Now, over the last week, the US has sent another 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe, supported by a couple thousand troops from other NATO allies as well. And of course, diplomatic efforts to avoid conflict and resolve the situation are continuing from all sides, but to be perfectly honest, no one is really being pragmatic here and actually working to solve the problem. Rather, politicians are doing as politicians do, and they are using this crisis point to boost their own polling, to look strong and brave in the face of the awful enemy. Now, the thing is here, for me at least, is that this situation really is important for all nations involved and not just the people of Ukraine. Now, to be clear, I firmly believe that the civilians on the ground in Ukraine should be put first here. They have an innate human right to self-determination, and Russia is threatening to infringe on that human right, and that is wrong, morally, categorically. Unfortunately, though, that is not the priority of pretty much any other party at stake here. Germany's priority is basically to keep oil and gas flowing westwards. The US and the UK's priority is to ensure that Russia's attempted expansion westwards, like we saw in 2014, doesn't come at the expense of NATO allies and Western influence in countries like Poland and the Baltic states if Ukraine should be invaded. Russia's aim, though, is the really interesting one because it's something that almost no one truly understands, and it isn't actually to keep Ukraine out of NATO, and it isn't actually to stop NATO from expanding either, and it isn't just to get bigger and more powerful. Russia's aim here is simply to destabilize the West. And this is where analysts continually get things wrong, and the reason they never understand the actions that Russia and Putin choose to take is simply because they don't understand Russia's real aim. Now, don't get me wrong, there are always secondary objectives, there are always externalities, and it's nice if they are beneficial as well. But the primary aim of almost everything that Russia does on the geopolitical stage is simply to disrupt the West, whether it be in the way our politics run, our markets, our energy security, whatever the specific faculty that Russia chooses to target, disruption is the ultimate aim, not an externality. A perfect example of this was a few years ago when Russian security forces tried to assassinate a Cold War era spy in Salisbury in the UK. Now, everyone spoke about why Russia would even bother with this. The man wasn't valuable. The information he had was decades out of date, and it had already been given in its entirety to intelligence agencies in the West. But that's just it. Russia didn't really care that this man was alive and well in the UK. Yes, it's a positive externality for Russia that maybe other people in Russia are slightly less likely to leak state secrets because they might be targeted like this man was. But the threat that these people who leak state secrets are already seeing is already death, so this really isn't much of a deterrent anyway. No, the aim of this mission was simply to disrupt British politics and politics in the West as a whole, to drive a wedge in between people in the UK and other governments, the government, its institutions, and it worked. Some countries were very unhappy about this. They sought to support the UK as they sanctioned Russia, and some other countries tried to do the opposite and tame tensions because they had their own priorities at stake. In the UK in particular, Jeremy Corbyn instantly came out in support of the Russian government. The leader of the opposition, the leader of the Labour Party, supported what pretty much amounts to a fascist state in an assassination attempt on foreign soil, and it was in the news for months and it left scars in British politics, and that is the perfect example of destabilization. Now today, and with regards to Ukraine, Russia is well aware of Europe's dependency on oil and gas from the east, and they're also well aware that NATO is not a monolith. It is an alliance of 30 nations, each with their own priorities, who are often at each other's throats over a number of different issues. Trump just a few years ago threatened to abandon NATO if European countries didn't start adequately funding their militaries, something that no, the US probably would have never actually gone through with, but it's a point of tension for NATO countries. And guess what? A country like Spain just isn't that afraid of Russia. It's on the other side of Europe, and its economy has been in the toilet for the last decade, and COVID has destroyed its tourism industry as well now. The vast majority of people in Spain simply don't care what happens in Ukraine. Now, Germany is just obsessed with its economic might and is more than happy to make short-sighted deals with China if it means more manufacturing takes place in this country, and it's also incredibly dependent on Eastern oil and gas in particular, so it wants to keep energy flowing and money flowing as well. The US wants to ensure its influence doesn't wane. It wants to ensure that it's the world hegemon for at least a few more decades, and that means not backing down to Russia's demands. What Russia is doing in Ukraine isn't really about Ukraine. It's about driving a wedge between Western countries and people in those countries as well. I've heard countless people in recent days, and I'm sure you have as well, say something along the lines of, why die for Ukraine? And countless others, myself included here, are likening Putin in Ukraine to Hitler in Czechoslovakia. Russia is well aware that every time they move another 10,000 troops onto the Ukrainian border, oil and gas prices spike and supply chains all over the world get just a little bit tighter. They're well aware that Germany is desperate to keep those prices low, and that as a result, they're reluctant to oppose Russia, and that frustrates the US, the UK, and France. People need to start looking behind the curtains of what's going on, to start seeing through the smoke and mirrors, and recognize that what you see is very rarely what you get. Just like I frequently talk about the Federal Reserve's secret mandate to maintain high asset prices, Russia has a secret target here as well, and until you accept that and put Russian moves into that context, everything that happens will continue to bewilder you. Now, make no mistake, this isn't going to be the end of the situation in Ukraine, and I don't really believe that Russia will actually invade Ukraine either. But Russia is going to prolong the crisis for as long as possible because it achieves their aims. They will probably also achieve a few secondary objectives as well. Russian troops will likely never leave Belarus again, ensuring their presence is always felt by the Belarusian government and Russian influence is increased. Russian exports of oil and gas will be worth more, and that extra revenue for the Russian government is well needed and will be appreciated. But as long as Russia is successful in their disruption of the West, they will continue to try to push for it further and further still. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and a comment to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world-famous artists like Banksy, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets. It's completely free to sign up, you don't have to buy anything, you don't have to hand over any card information, so if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you'll get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Thank you all for the support. Thanks for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.